You know, I was sitting here watching Pete Hegseth testify before the Senate Appropriations Committee today. And I want to talk to you about something that really ought to concern every American, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. Because what happened on Capitol Hill this afternoon wasn't just political theater. It was a window into how decisions are being made or not being made about a war that is costing American lives, costing American treasure, and reshaping the Middle East in ways we may not fully understand for a generation. Now, I've been around Washington long enough to know that Senate hearings can sometimes produce more heat than light. But every now and then, a witness says something under oath, under pressure, that cuts right through all the noise. And today, Defense Secretary Hegseth said several things that I think deserve your full attention. We'll get into the specifics in a moment. But first, I want you to understand the stakes here, because this isn't about one hearing. This is about whether the American people are being told the truth about a war being fought in their name. Let me give you the context, because context matters. The United States has been at war with Iran since late February of this year. Operation Epic Fury, they're calling it. It started with massive air and naval strikes carried out jointly with Israel, targeting Iranian military infrastructure, missile sites, and what the administration said were active nuclear facilities. Now, the original justification was straightforward. The administration said Iran was within 2 weeks of having a nuclear weapon, and that military action was the only option left. And I want to be fair here. Preventing a nuclear Iran is something that both parties have agreed on for decades. When I was in the White House, we worked every diplomatic channel available to contain that threat. And I'll tell you plainly, if Iran had actually been 2 weeks away from a bomb, any president would have faced enormous pressure to act. So the question was never really whether preventing a nuclear Iran matters. Of course it does. The question is whether the way this war has been conducted, the planning, the transparency, the strategy for getting out, meets the standard the American people have a right to expect from their government. And that brings us to what happened today. Here's what Secretary Hegseth told the Senate Appropriations Committee. He put the cost of the war at $37.5 billion. Now think about that number for a second. $37.5 billion in roughly 5 months. And that's just the figure the Pentagon is willing to acknowledge publicly. Many experts believe the real cost is significantly higher when you factor in base damage, repositioned assets, and long-term equipment wear. On top of that, the administration is now asking Congress for an additional $87.6 billion in supplemental funding, with $67 billion of that going straight to the Pentagon for the war. 17 American service members have been killed. Nearly 450 have been injured since the conflict began, with more than 100 wounded just this month. And here's the detail that stopped me cold. Senator Gillibrand looked Hegseth right in the eye and said, essentially, your own words don't add up. She reminded him that after Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025, He told the American people that Iran's nuclear capability had been obliterated. His word, not mine, obliterated. Yet 8 months later, the administration launched a full-scale war, claiming Iran was on the doorstep of a nuclear weapon. And when pressed, Hegseth's answer was that the sites had indeed been obliterated, but the Iranians, quote, foolishly continued to attempt to pursue nuclear capabilities. Now, I've been in rooms where you have to explain difficult decisions to the American people. And I learned something early on. You cannot tell the country the threat has been eliminated and then use that same threat to justify a war. It just doesn't work both ways. And this is where things start to get complicated, because the contradictions didn't stop there. A Democratic senator pressed Hegseth on something that should trouble every single one of us. Back on April 8th, Hegseth publicly declared that Iran's missile program was, quote, functionally destroyed. Launchers, production facilities, and stockpiles depleted and decimated. Those were his exact words. But as of this week, Iran is actively launching strikes against American military positions across the Middle East. American soldiers are being hit. American soldiers are being killed. So the senator asked the obvious question: how is that possible if the capability was destroyed 3 months ago? And to his credit, after being cornered, Hegseth conceded the point. He acknowledged that Iran, quote, still has capabilities. Now look, I understand the fog of war. I understand that military assessments evolve. But there's a difference between evolving assessments and telling the American people the job is done when it clearly isn't. When I was commander-in-chief, I had to make difficult calls about military operations in the Balkans, in Iraq, and counterterrorism operations. And one thing I learned is that the moment you start telling the public what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear, you lose something you can never fully get back. You lose trust. Senator Jack Reed raised this very concern years ago with Hegseth's predecessor hearings, saying he believed his secretary was, quote, telling the president what he wants to hear instead of what he needs to hear. And Senator Collins, a Republican, mind you, opened today's hearing by calling it deeply troubling that the Pentagon has been blocking promotions of qualified officers, particularly women and minorities. That's a Republican chair of the committee saying her own administration's defense secretary is weakening the military from inside. Now, let me talk about what this means for our institutions, because that's really what keeps me up at night. The strength of American democracy has never rested on any one president or any one party. It rests on a system, on checks and balances, on congressional oversight, on the idea that when we send Americans into harm's way, the people's representatives get honest answers about why we're fighting, how much it's costing, and when it's going to end. And what I saw today was that system being tested in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of some of the worst chapters in our history. Senator Schumer pointed out that while Hegseth was withholding casualty numbers from the public, he was out promoting a plan for testosterone screenings for the troops. Now, I don't want to make light of military readiness programs. That's a serious matter. But when the Defense Secretary's public calendar is focused on supplements, while families are waiting to find out if their sons and daughters are safe, something has gone wrong with our priorities. Senator Patty Murray, one of the most thoughtful voices on national security in the Senate, warned today that this could become another forever war. And she noted that President Trump has told the American people over 40 times now that a deal is near and the war will be over soon. Over 40 times. Yet each time the ask gets bigger. First it was the initial appropriation, then it was supplemental requests, and now it's another $87 billion. At some point, you have to ask, if the deal is always near, why does the bill keep growing? The Senate has voted nearly a dozen times on war powers resolutions to try to reassert its constitutional role in this conflict. 12 times. And still, the administration has sidestepped the basic question that even Republican Senator John Kennedy said needs answering. Why did we go in, and how do we get out? Let me tell you something about how political strategy intersects with war, because I've seen this movie before. This supplemental budget package isn't just about the war. It's a $95 billion omnibus that bundles Iran war funding together with $10 billion for farmers struggling under the tariff regime and another $10 billion for voting law changes that are almost certainly going to include new ID requirements. None of it offset by spending cuts elsewhere. Now, politically, this is a familiar play. You tie war funding to domestic priorities so that voting against the package looks like you're abandoning the troops or abandoning farmers. But here's what that really means in practice. It means that hard questions about the war's cost and strategy get buried under political horse trading. It means that members of Congress who might otherwise demand a clearer exit strategy or more transparent casualty reporting have to weigh those concerns against whether their farming constituents back home get relief. And with midterm elections coming up this fall, the pressure to pass something, anything, before Congress recesses is enormous. That's not governance. That's leveraging a war to advance a legislative agenda. And both parties, frankly, have been guilty of this kind of bundling over the years. But the scale of it here, tying $67 billion in war funding to voting law changes, is something the American people should look at very carefully. So where does this go from here? Well, I think there are a few possible paths, and none of them are particularly reassuring. The first possibility is that the supplemental passes largely as written. The war continues to escalate, and we find ourselves deeper into a conflict with no clear end state and a price tag that could easily reach $200 billion or more, a figure the Pentagon itself floated just months ago. The second possibility is that enough Republicans, and we saw cracks today with Collins, with Kennedy, join with Democrats to impose real conditions on the funding. That could mean mandatory progress reports, binding timelines for casualty disclosure, or a genuine war powers vote that forces the administration to articulate an exit strategy. The third and most dangerous possibility is what Senator Murray was warning about, that this becomes a forever war by inertia. not because anyone planned it that way, but because no one in a position of authority had the political courage to say, here is our objective, here is our timeline, and here is how we define success. I lived through the aftermath of Vietnam. I governed during a period when we were still learning the lessons of that conflict. And one of the clearest lessons was this: when a government cannot clearly explain to its own people what victory looks like, it has already lost something more important than any battle. The American people are patient. They are patriotic. They will support difficult decisions if they believe their leaders are being straight with them. But patience has a limit. And today's hearing suggested we may be approaching it. I want to close with this thought because it's something I believe deeply. And it goes beyond any one administration or any one war. The strength of this country has never been just our military might, though Lord knows we have plenty of that. Our real strength is the trust between the governed and the governing. It's the idea that when a president sends men and women into combat, there's an honest compact. We will tell you why, we will tell you how much, and we will tell you when they're coming home. What I watched today with the Defense Secretary who could not reconcile his own past statements with the reality on the ground, who acknowledged under pressure that the enemy he declared destroyed still has the capability to kill Americans, and who came before the Senate not with a strategy for ending a war, but with a request for more money to continue one. Now, I want to be clear. I am not questioning the courage of our service members. Lord, no. Those 17 men and women who gave their lives, those hundreds who are carrying wounds, both visible and invisible, they did everything their country asked of them and more. What I am questioning is whether the leaders sending them into harm's way have done the same. America has corrected course before. We have the institutions, we have the constitutional framework, and we have the people to demand accountability when it's lacking. But that only works if we pay attention. It only works if we ask the hard questions before the next $87 billion goes out the door. So I'd ask you, watch the hearing, read the transcripts, talk to your neighbors about what you think this war should look like and when it should end. Because in a democracy, those decisions don't belong to any one secretary or any one president. They belong to you. And right now, more than ever, your voice matters.